Back at it again with another video. Thank you all so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So this video is talking about taking back Crimea if you are Ukraine. So right now, Ukraine is not in control of Crimea. Crimea was seized in 2014, and the Russians used Crimea kind of as a launching pad for their offensives in the south at the early phases of the war, of the full-scale war and the invasion in February of last year. So, ultimately, Crimea is Ukraine, and there's only a handful of ways to get into Crimea. So there's a road from Kherson down towards Sevastopol. That is the E97 or H05, or depending on your classification of that. And then there's a road from Melitopol down towards Sevastopol, and that is E105 according to Google Maps. So there's two ways down from the north. You go from Kherson down into Crimea, or Melitopol down towards Crimea that way. And the only other way into Crimea by land is the Kerch Strait Bridge. And the Ukrainians have already shown that they can hit the Kerch Strait. And that also is, according to Google Maps, also E97 from Kerch across to Taman and into Russia proper, over here towards Novorossiysk. So there's only three ways in by land. You can go in by sea or by air, but as we've seen, the Russians' logistics is just terrible. They either go by road or by rail. So if you're Ukraine and you're planning to try and take Crimea, you don't have to storm the gates. You don't have to bust down the door, blow it off its hinges, and storm Crimea. I mean, you can if you really, really want to. But you could just lay siege to it. You have the long-range weapons to block off the three access points, the Kerch Strait and the two road networks from Kherson and Melitopol down into Crimea. If you don't allow the Russians to resupply their forces, Crimea becomes untenable, because in terms of sea capacity, in terms of logistics, the Russians don't have anything. We saw that the Moskva was sunk, so the Ukrainians have proven that they can sink Russian flagships, Russian Black Sea Fleet. They've shown that they can take down Russian warships. In terms of air, in terms of logistics, the Russians don't have it. They just don't. The only way that Crimea is resupplied is the land bridge from Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol into Crimea, or from Rostov-on-Don through the Kerch Strait and into Crimea. Those are the only two ways the Russians are able to resupply Crimea. The land corridor from Mariupol down, or the Kerch Strait. So the line of contact has been relatively the same ever since the fall. In the fall, the Ukrainians took back much of the Kharkiv Oblast and much of the entirety of the north bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson Oblast. So again, there's only a handful of ways the Russians can resupply. Down through Luhansk, Mariupol, Melitopol, and into Crimea. Or Rostov-on-Don all the way down through the Kerch Strait Bridge and into Crimea. Those are the only two ways that they can resupply their forces, because they don't have sea lift or airlift capacity to resupply and retool and re-equip their forces. They just don't have it. The Russians resupply their soldiers by road and by rail. If you block those three access points to Crimea, you don't have to storm it to take it. You just have to lay siege to it for long enough, and the longer the siege lays and you block all those access points, it becomes untenable for the Russians to keep Crimea. It's a peninsula. It's essentially an island, because if you look at it, this is, it's more or less, it is a peninsula, but it looks like a massive island, because it kind of is. with only a handful of ways in. There are only 3 by road or rail, or you take your ships into Sevastopol, but Sevastopol is not safe because the Ukrainians have hit Sevastopol with drones, with missiles, with a handful of other tools to use. And if you know Yalta, if you're a World War II history buff like myself, you'll know that Yalta was the Yalta Conference. That was, I think, 43 or early 44. But yeah, there's only a handful of ways you get into Crimea. Now, this upcoming counteroffensive, there's only a handful of ways you can go if you are Ukraine. You either cross the Dnipro from Kherson down to Crimea, and you force this force posture down into Crimea. Or you go down from Zaporizhia, you go straight due south. You break the Russian line, you go into Melitopol, you go into Berdyansk, or you go into Mariupol. Mariupol is symbolically very important because of the siege of Mariupol between, I think it was, I don't even remember. It was early in the invasion. The siege of the Azovstal steel plant. Mariupol is super symbolic for the Ukrainians. You either push down from Zaporizhia either to Melitopol, Berdyansk, or Mariupol. Punch straight to the Sea of Azov. Or you cross the Dnipro, which is not impossible, but logistically complicated. Or you somehow find a way to pierce through all of this, but that's a lot of force right there. The easiest ways for the Ukrainians to isolate Crimea is to punch down from Zaporizhia to the sea or Kherson to Crimea. Once this land bridge is gone, and once you control the 2 access points up here and you destroy or damage the Kerch Strait severely, all you have to do is lay siege, just like the Russians laid siege to Mariupol. You cut off their supplies, and you make the situation just utterly untenable for the Russians, and watch them squirm. So I think this is already the plan. So the line of contact is the Dnipro, and then all the way up about here, more or less. You got Bakhmut right here. So personally, I would say the easiest route is just punch down from Zaporizhia straight to Melitopol with as much armor as possible. Punch down, you separate the line, and you divide the Russians in 2 over here and down here. But that's just me personally. You cut off the access points and you lay siege to Crimea. Or you could storm it, but that would result in a lot of casualties. All you have to do is lay siege and watch the Russians just, make it so untenable for the Russians. So that would be my way of taking back Crimea, and it's possible because the Ukrainians have already shown they can take out or damage the Kerch Strait, and then all you have to do is just block the access points in the top, whether by soldiers, whether by missiles, whether by drones, whatever works. So that's how I would take back Crimea if I was in charge of Ukrainian forces. But I'm not, and that is up to them. I think their spring offensive is going to be wildly successful, and ultimately I think the wars hopefully come to an end within the next year, but only time will tell. So with that, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video. Deuces.